that there might be issues, and it might not be you, the issues being my end feed. If that happens, we'll deal with it. First thing I would try is to just get back on the Zoom. So if people would be willing to give me that chance and come back on the Zoom if it like accidentally logs me off, that'd be great. But if somehow that's impossible for me, like if I just can't log on back into the Zoom, I'll send you an email. I'll send you an email and let you know what is happening. Okay, Juliana's telling me that my picture is freezing. Okay, so fortunately, my image is not that important. Once I share my screen, hopefully, as long as you can see that. But if anybody has trouble, like when I share my screen, if things are too spotty, let me know and I will, I'll do my best to fix that, or at least not be switching back and forth between screens. And that usually makes things a little bit better. Okay, so first thing, I just finished right before class grading all of the discussion board posts from that were due last Sunday, and for the most part, I've been loving all your answers. You're all giving me complete answers, and I can see like one that you've paid attention during lecture, and that you're sharing your thought process in the discussion board post, which is exactly what I'm looking for. I did notice one recurring issue that kept coming back in several of your answers. So this was not a one-person thing, this was a several-person thing, where when I asked you in the first question why the Chinese were not the ones to reach the Americas before the Europeans, the geography question came up. So I'm sharing my screen, a map of the world. Right, this is the standard map most people are used to, right? And when you look at this map, it might look like the Europeans have an easier access to the Americas. They just have to cross the Atlantic, whereas China looks like the way we cut off the map doesn't look correct, right? But a flip of map, if you focus the map on the Pacific, it looks weird to us because it's cut off in a way that we're not used to. But if you look at it this way, you see that China did have a path through the Pacific to reach the Americas. But even if the way the currents move in the Atlantic versus the Pacific, it is different. But even if you take the Pacific out of the equation, and you remember that the voyages of Shen He were in the Indian Ocean. So in this area right here, where I'm showing with my pointer, so over here by India, the way that these had navigated through the Indian Ocean, they come all the way down through India and had started making their way down the coast of East Africa. In fact, they almost got to the tip of South Africa, which would have given them immediate access to the Atlantic. And if we go back to this other map, once they made it this way, right, to the tip of the Atlantic, then those currents would have easily taken them to the Americas. So geographically, it was not that much more harder for the Chinese to get to the Americas than it would have been for the Europeans. Emily says it's cutting out. Okay. I'm going to take it slowly. So anyways, the point of that is to emphasize that the geography of Europe versus China is not a factor in explaining how I was the Chinese, right? Better answers involve the fact that the Chinese didn't seem to want to. Not that they didn't have colonies, they absolutely had colonies. They just ended up inward, right? Focusing on internal conflict rather than focusing on maintaining colonies. The other answers are also cultural, about just there's no value for them in gaining some of these colonies culturally. There's other answers that are just basically better than the geography one. So I took points off if you just gave me the geography answer, especially. So you had to give me other things too for that question. But if anybody has questions on the grading, please let me know. All right, I'm going to transition here slowly. So the next thing we need to talk about is the paper. Right. So this week you do have some work to do, but at the end of week 5, you have a paper due. So Sunday of next week is your first paper for my class. And let me know in the chat what things get cut off so that I can repeat the information you all need. If you go to week 5 or to assignments, okay, it freezes and continues. Okay. So if you look at the prompt, I went through the prompt last week, so you can always go back and look at that. But the main point for this paper is for you to analyze one of the databases on the website, Slave Voyages. So this is put together by a bunch of scholars with really just great information there. So your job is to analyze one of the databases and then answer these questions, right? The paper should have a thesis. Right? It should have a thesis, and your thesis should make an argument about the value of the database. Right? The reason I'm asking you to do that is because these databases on the website, and let me click over to that, give you information, right? It's just data. They don't necessarily give you explanations. They just give you the raw data in the database. Right, so there's several different databases you can choose from. You can choose the Transatlantic, the Intra-American, or the People of the Atlantic Slave Trade database. Which database you use is not as important to me, right? Because at the end, it's giving you raw data. So you use any of these databases that are on this website. Once you click on the database, you see all the vast information these databases hold. Right. So I do want you to look through it, and you don't even need to look at every page, because if you look at how many pages some of these databases have, you look down here, it's 1,919 of these pages with information. So you don't need to look at absolutely every single page, but you want to look at enough pages that you can make an analysis about why this data is important, right? Because with history, with any type of source, the key is, what does this information tell us? And what does this information leave out? Right? Now, if you really need help, if you're looking at this data and you're like, it's not telling me enough, if you're being blocked there, if you have a mental block in terms of analysis, what will help is if you go to the links called Understanding the Database. Every database has these articles called Understanding the Database, right? Each written for those database, right? The American page called Understanding the Data. Go to it. But it does give you information. I recommend reading the Understanding the Databases on each websites. Or how it kicked me out. Okay. It looks like it only kicked me out and then it brought me back up. So when did it kick me off? What was I saying?
It froze even before you got logged off.
Really? Okay, so what was I saying before it froze me?
You were talking about the database, like the information, if we ever get stuck.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so if you get stuck, I'm looking at that. In fact, I think it's because of that website, Slave Voyages. It was using up a lot of it because it has graphics and a lot of it stuff on it. So it was using too much internet apparently. Is the freezing better now?
Yeah.
Or is okay? I think it was that. So we're not going to go to the website, but the databases on that website, there's at least 3. There's actually 4. If you find the 4th hidden one, you can use it. But when you use the drop-down menu to get to the databases, there is understanding the database links that give you a lot of background information. And that background information is really useful. I actually do recommend reading it before you begin writing. However, if you're going to be using that information, it needs to be cited. And I am asking everybody to cite Chicago style. So I want to go through citing Chicago style. So a few of you have told me that you've used it. So tell me, what is the main difference? Those of you that have used Chicago style, what is the main difference between Chicago style and MLA style, for example? Like, I know some of you have used it. No one, or am I lagging? All right, so before I go on, let me ask you, can you all hear me without too much freezing or lag?
Yes.
Okay, good, because I'm like, now the question is going to be, did I freeze, or did I, like, is my computer acting out? Okay, so the main difference is in MLA, you put in the parentheses at the end of the sentence, the citation information, right? As you're typing, you're writing the information at the end of the sentence. In Chicago style, you don't do that. Instead, you insert a footnote or an endnote. Right? Let me show you some examples of how to do that, because that's actually the key. Once you figure out how to insert a footnote or an endnote, Chicago style becomes so much easier. Excuse this thing here. Okay, so I'm on a Word document here. And like in MLA style, you're writing your sentence. And let's say you're writing something very brilliant here, lots of words. Well, at the end of the sentence, in parentheses, you will type in like the last name of the source and like a page number if you're citing a book. That's how you cite in MLA. Well, in Chicago style, instead of all of that, what you do is you would write your brilliant sentence, and then you put a period and leave the cursor at the end of the period, right? Now, instead of putting anything in parentheses, you want to insert a footnote here. And I'm going to show you footnotes because I think it's what I like to use best. And you'll see once I do it why most people like footnotes. Well, on Word, to insert a footnote, you go to here. Well, you can go to insert, of course. But you can also go to references. If you go to references, there's a big button here called insert footnote. Right now, don't get distracted by some of this insert endnote or next footnote. You don't want to ever click any of those for this process. You want to click just insert footnote and watch what happens when I do that. You'll see that it placed a 1 at the end of the sentence, and then it created a space at the end of the sentence. Hopefully you also have, let's say you write another sentence and it also needs citation. You do the same thing. You go to references, insert footnote, and then it numbers all the citations for you. So you don't have to give it a number or anything. It automatically does it for you. So here's another sentence. The cursor's at the end of the period, and then you insert footnote. And it creates this space at the bottom of the page. So sometimes if you have a lot of citations, you can take up a lot of space at the bottom of the page. That's totally okay. It doesn't matter how much space you're taking at the bottom, as long as you're citing correctly. So in Chicago style, the big question is, what information do you put at in the footnote, right? Over here at the bottom of the page. Well, you're going to want to cite the website. You're going to want to cite maybe a reading class, right? And I told you it was really easy for you. Let me go back to If you go to in the prompt on Canvas, I'm giving you how to cite almost you will. So how I cite the database, because every needs a database. Well, basically copy and paste. Now, the trick is every database has to be cited individually. It's laggy. Okay. Let me stop sharing. I think it's laggier when I share my screen, isn't it? Is it laggier when yeah, okay. Then let me stop that. No more sharing the screen. I will do today then, because of this issue with the internet, is let's have a shorter class. Let's have a shorter class, and instead, I'll cover some of this information next week. But all the information you will need for writing the paper, I will do a separate video on it, and I will post it on Canvas and send it over email. Does that sound okay? Would that work for everybody?
Professor, would you add what goes under the citations in that video?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
Yes, exactly. Because my goal with the citation is to make it easier. So everything you will need on how to cite, like the databases, is already in the prompt. You basically will have to copy and paste and only change things so that to make sure that it matches what you're citing. But most of it will be copy and paste for you all. But I will do the video will be specifically on that, and I will show you it. A sample, yes, Alexandria, absolutely. That was my plan today, is to give you a specific example on how the citation works. So I will absolutely do that in the video. Yes. Thesis. I will also give an example of the thesis. Yes, because for this particular paper, you do need a thesis, an argument. And something like the database gives us good information on slavery is not a good enough thesis. It's not a good enough thesis. So as a result, you want and really say something else about the information the database gives you, right? So I want you, that's the goal, is to force you to think deeper about what information is there, right? And I will answer part of the prompt for you. For example, part of the prompt asks you what information is left out of the database. Well, that's what I wanted to talk about today. The things that get left out of the database is the human stories, right? Those databases give you numbers of how many people were enslaved, where they were enslaved from, and where they are taken to, right? It's all information on that. You can get a lot of useful information from that. But what those numbers don't tell you is the story of those individuals. And in fact, at times it can be really difficult to get those stories, right? Now, one place where you do get some of those stories is in one of the readings for today. The Two Princes of Calabar, the Two Princes of Calabar, that document that you do have to comment on perusal, gives you the story of two individuals, right? And that paper, the part of the reason I assigned it is because that paper does a really good job of starting with just data, right? And I saw a handful of you have already done the reading because you've added comments on perusal. That paper begins with giving you a lot of just data, and then it transitions from data into the personal stories of people. Well, what you're going to have to do for your paper is similar. It's kind of analyzing the data in the same way that this article did. And one of the things you might want to highlight in your paper is the fact that those personal stories are missing, right? So let's talk a little bit about what was in the Two Princes of Calabar reading. So, because a few of you have already read it, tell me what stood out to you about this article and the story of the two princes. Yeah.
Oh, you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I think it was interesting that it talked a lot about how there were like little kingdoms and towns in Africa that were profiting off of this slave trade, because we didn't really learn a lot about that in like middle school or elementary school or high school. It didn't really talk about like slavery
Yeah.
in Africa, like how they got them. I think like the most they told us was like, oh, like, you know, the Europeans came and just got them. Not the like complex system they
Yeah.
had established there.
And that's an extremely important point. For those of you who haven't gotten to the reading, pay attention to that, because the Europeans, when they arrive on the west coast of Africa, because that's mostly where the slave trade is happening, they are not powerful enough to completely colonize Africa, the whole continent. They couldn't have enslaved that many people just on their own. They needed the help of local African tribes. Right. And initially, actually, local tribes didn't want to participate in this initially until an economic relation local tribes and Europeans, and then it becomes really profitable for African groups to work with the Europeans and enslave other Africans. Now, sometimes when this issue comes up online, and I've seen lots of conversations on like Twitter and on different sources online that try to use that as a gotcha, like, aha, it wasn't just the Europeans, Africans were enslaving their own people. Having read the article, what's wrong with that comment? The people that argue, aha, Africans were enslaving their own people. Why is it not really a true statement?
I think it was- oh,
No, you can go.
are you sure? Go for it.
No, you got it. I did the last one.
I will pick Diane. You can say it, and then Alexandra can add in.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I just think it was like, yeah, how she said, it's very complex, obviously we know who benefited the most out of it at the end, and like who probably took it to the extreme, which is probably the Europeans, just like the way they establish like such organization of it. And but besides that, like to the point is that they had to, I think it was more like they didn't think of it like as a race. Like Africans, they thought of it as other tribes, like their other enemy tribes. The same way when, the way I see it, the same way when they first came to the Americas and you had help of Native Americans hunting other Native Americans because they were their enemy tribe. And those people would benefit because like once they wipe out that person for, let's say, the benefit of the Europeans and their own benefit, they would probably like get their land, or they would inherit who knows what that's important to them in their culture, because I'm pretty sure that's what was exactly happening with the African tribes, the African nations, that there was different tribes all over, and there was warring states, and it was to their own benefit in a way. And I don't think they really understood. They never had that sense of unity as a race, like we're African, then those are Europeans. It was more just like these are our enemies, and the enemy of my enemy is my friend, something like that, right? So I think that's kind of what it was.
Absolutely. Alexandra, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I was just gonna say that in the reading it talked a lot about how the Europeans that came like forced them to do it sometimes, or like took their sons captive, or like blocked the rivers so they couldn't access like trade or anything else until they like did what they wanted them to do.
Yes, and that's really important. Lou, you have your hand up. Did you want to add?
Yes, I was gonna say, like, if the same was like expected of the Europeans would also betray like other European countries if it benefited them the most. Like Spain would betray England if he could, and England would do the same for France and everyone else. It's just a matter of like kingdoms. And I think the perspective, a lot of people just think that Africans didn't have like kingdoms like the Europeans. That's why they think that like, ha, gotcha moment, when in reality they did have like kingdoms and like I guess communities that needed to prosper somehow.
Exactly. And Lou, you just hit the nail on the head on why I assigned those readings on perusal, right? One of them talks specifically about how Africa, the continent, has a history before Europeans. One that historians often ignored up until like the 1980s. Actually, most of that history was ignored and wrongly, like historians wrote about it in a really racist and horrible manner. Like they were flat out wrong. In the 80s, a new kind of history was written about this that focused more on, hey, when Europeans arrived on the African continent, there was already well-developed groups. And you can see that by looking at the slave trade and how Europeans interact with local groups. That one part of what makes possible the enslavement of some Africans is that there was already conflicts within African groups. So oftentimes people were not enslaving members of their communities. They were going deeper into Africa and enslaving enemy groups or other groups that they came across. They were never enslaving their own people necessarily, right? And there were certain groups in Africa who were better positioned to engage in the Europeans. So the article talks specifically about the Efik. The Efik were actually needed by the Europeans. The Europeans couldn't have worked without the help of the Efik because of very specific reasons. Does anybody recall what made the Efik well positioned to engage in the slave trade? It's on page 559 of the document. But someone might remember why the Efik in particular were really well suited or well positioned. Like this document yet on page 559 of the document, it talks about how the Efik had the ships, the canoes that could navigate internal rivers within that region of Africa. Right, it's the Bight of Biafra and the Cross River. Those rivers, there's a complex network of rivers in that area that European ships were too big for. They're just too big. They could not navigate in. The Efik, however, their canoes were created to navigate those rivers, and that made them able to go deeper into that region and capture other people for enslavement. That's something, for example, the Europeans couldn't do on their own. Now, Alexandra hit on another major point, and that is the one question that that historians have asked is, okay, if the Europeans worked with African groups to engage in the slave trade, what were those relationships like between the Europeans and the African groups? Were they equal? The two groups equal in power, negotiating with each other? Or was there an imbalance of power there? Was one group abusing the other in some way or using the other group in a way that made them not equal? Right. Alexandria was arguing that there is evidence here that the Europeans forced Africans to engage in the slave trade, often by kidnapping members of the tribe, of their families, and then forcing, hey, if you want these people back, bring us slaves, right? If they're doing that, then it's not a balanced relationship, right? It's somebody being forced to engage in the slave trade without wanting to. So did anybody get a different sense? Did anybody get a sense that this was more of an equal relationship between two partners? Pay attention. So those of you that haven't read it, on pages 562, 563, 564, and 65 is the pages that handle that question, where they give you the evidence. The author gives you the evidence of to answer the question. Is this a relationship between equals, or is there a power dynamic happening? So if you're looking for what to comment on, look for that question. It's not a question I can give you the answer to. I mean, I could give you my answer to it, but it's debatable. It's debatable on what you see the evidence and what do you think is the most important evidence that you get in that reading. So I want to hear your thoughts on that as you're commenting on the Perusa reading. Like Alexandria made an excellent argument for arguing that this was not a relationship of equals, because you have these instances of Europeans forcing Africans to engage in the slave trade. But I want to see, once reading it, what you all think, or as you're reading it. Right now, the story then shifts into the story of these two princes. So it's these two men who were princes, Ephraim and Ancona, and they were actually engaging in slave trade. They were active participants. They captured other Africans and sold them to the Europeans, knowing that those people were going to be taken somewhere to the Americas to be enslaved. Now, at first, when the slave trade began, it wasn't clear what slavery would look like, because slavery already existed in the African continent. It was not new. But it's new in the Atlantic slave trade, right? And this mass trading of Africans was the brutality of it. In the past, I mean, slavery is never easy, right? But there was a different nature to the slavery, and it was not based on race. In the past, some enslaved people could actually earn their freedom. Some, depending on who the person that owned them were, could be treated better. There was much more diversity in the kind of experience people had as slaves. Not saying that slavery was better before this, but that there was diversity in people's experiences. Once we get to this kind of slavery, right, that the Europeans are doing in the transatlantic, it's extremely harsh, and it's based on race, right? So it is very different. So at first, when people begin engaging in it, when Africans begin engaging in the slave trade, they're not necessarily sure how the Europeans are going to do it. But very quickly, it does become clear that this slavery was very harsh and different than the kind of slavery that existed beforehand. So by the time our two princes are engaged in the slave trade, they know what's happening, right? They know the kind of horrors that the people that they're capturing and selling to the Europeans will endure. But something very interesting happens to these two men. Those of you that have read it, tell the rest of the class, what happens to these two men who were actually, they were royals, they were princes. What happens to them? I'm like, huge spoiler alert, but you need to know this. Do they live a happy, fulfilled life in their tribe?
Not really. They get transported to, I think, what is now the Dominican Republic, and are sold as slaves, and then they escape and are sold as slaves again, like 3 more times.
Yeah.
And then they finally make it back to somewhere in England, I think, for a couple years, and then like eventually make it back to where they're from, but like 10 years later.
Yeah, this is a rather unique story, because what we have is two elite African men, right? They're royalty. They get to trade the European traders they're working with. Like, they're told, let's have like basically a party on the ship, which was normal. This kind of celebrations were part of the trade that was happening. Well, instead of having a party, these two men get trapped on the slave ship, and they get taken to the Caribbean to be sold. And they do get sold. Now, because these men are royal and they actually speak English, right, they have certain advantages that most enslaved people didn't have, right? One, they kind of know the lay of the land. They know like who these ships belong to, and they have connections. So the first time they're enslaved, and it's actually Dominica, in the island of Dominica. So it's not the Dominican Republic, because, you know, they can't make these things easy. But the island of Dominica, they have an owner there that basically, although he still, he gives them a lot of leeway because these are educated men. So he uses them to kind of communicate with some of the ships that are coming into the island. As a result, because they already have relationships with some of the ships coming into the island, they are able to escape. But the kind of slavery they experienced first in Dominica is not the worst, harshest slavery. It's not typical of most people because of their education, because they can read and write, because they speak English. But okay, they find somebody they know on one of these ships that is going to supposedly help them go back home. Well, the slave trader, turns out you can't trust a slave trader. Instead of taking them back home, sells them in slavery in the Americas. They go back to Virginia. And yeah, you get a series of basically them trying to find their way back home and just staying and remaining as slaves in the Americas until they finally find another slaver that they know through their networks that takes them out of the US and back to the UK, to England. There we have an extra layer. So it's a unique story because these men have means of at least trying to escape slavery. Right? For most people, that was not a reality. Right? That was just not a reality. These men do have this means, and they do manage to make it back to England. In England, something really interesting happens because technically, in most European countries at this time, slavery was illegal. In England, slavery was technically illegal. Same thing in France, slavery was technically illegal. So the two men reach London, right? And they think, this is great. We're not back home, but from here, we will be able to easily make our way back home. Alexandra can tell us, do they easily make their way back home once they reach London?
No, they're there for a long time too.
It takes them, like another decade because they have to work through the British legal system, right? Technically, they're able to sue. They arrive in London and they can sue for their freedom and to be allowed to go back home. The problem was British law. While slavery is technically illegal, it's not clearly defined in British law. And to give these men their freedom and let them go back home would be the equivalent of abolishing slavery in all of English law and colonies. So the British don't want to let these two princes go back home. So they basically establish all these legal roadblocks so that they don't have to send them back home, right? And this kind of, their story kind of links almost every aspect of the slave trade, right? From the coast of West Africa to the Caribbean to what is now the US and then back to England. It kind of connects multiple dots within the transatlantic slave trade. So this is the one document that I want you to focus more on. The other document, by the way, you can skim. Make your 3 comments, skim. But the 2 Princes of Telebar, I want to hear your comments on, and I've already been reading everybody's comments on it. This is where I'm going to go into one of the questions for the discussion board post, which is the freedom principle, right? Instead of talking about England, because you're going to get England from the reading, I'm going to talk a little bit about France. And France, like England, had unique laws within France. So technically, in the territory of France, of the hexagon, mainland France, slavery is illegal. Now, France has different laws in France versus in all their colonies, right? If you went to Martinique, to Guadeloupe, to Haiti, to other places where the French have colonies, slavery is not just legal, but it's the main economic source for those colonies. So let me ask you, why do you think the French would have slavery be okay and legal in the colonies, but not in actual France? Why would they have different laws for it? Yeah, Lou?
Because one of the reason might be it's more beneficial to have slaves in like colonies than the mainland, because you might have workers, and also people might start getting the idea of a revolution if they specifically see cruel way of how, like, let's say the government or the monarchs are treating the people.
Yeah, similar to what James is saying in the chat, so there people wouldn't know. And most people in France would have said, yeah, they didn't know the horrors of slavery. Yeah. And Manny's saying, in order to profit from slavery, well, they're not having different people in their mainland. Yeah, like Lou was saying, actually, at this point, the French are going to have the most profitable colony in the world. So this is before the British take over. The US was not the most profitable colony in the world. It was Haiti. It was the island, or the half of the island of Haiti, right? Because of the sugar that was being grown in Haiti, and because of how addictive and high demand for sugar, most of the world's sugar at the time was coming from Haiti. So that sugar growing depended entirely on slave labor, right? So there was no way to kind of abolish slavery in France. Basically, there was no way they were going to abolish slavery in their colonies. They were making too much money off of it. But at the time, there weren't that many enslaved people in France. And the law is technically there from way beforehand. The law that made slavery illegal in France goes back to Louis X, who wrote an edict, an ordinance in the year 1315. So this is significantly before the transatlantic slave trade begins. This French king, Louis X, wrote an ordinance that said, and this is a quote from and I have it on the slide, but it says, "We considered that our kingdom is called and named the Kingdom of Franks, and wishing that the thing be in true according to its name, have ordained and do ordain that generally throughout our kingdom, as much as it can be shared by us and our successors, such servitude will be restored to freedom at good suitable condition." So this is a law that King Louis X writes that says, and this is the key phrase, is such servitude will be restored to freedom. What the legal courts in France interpret that as is to mean that slavery is illegal on French soil. Now, it's a misinterpretation of what King Louis X wrote. What the king was talking about was certain types of serfdoms. There were certain serfs, basically like peasants that were legally tied to their owners, to the lords in France. He was giving certain kinds of serfs freedom, their legal freedom. But because that ordinance is written in a general enough language, some judges in French courts interpret it as slavery is illegal in France, right? And we do have evidence of enslaved people gaining their freedom when they arrived in France by suing the courts, suing their owners for their freedom, and winning. Every single enslaved person that took their owner to a French court in France won their freedom. It's like this amazing little loophole. Right? Now, of course, this law does not apply to Haiti. It does not apply to any other French territory other than the main kind of hexagon of France. The other thing is that there were loopholes to that law. There were actual enslaved people in France, right? Because so many French people were making huge amounts of money off of slavery, they petitioned the French courts to allow them to bring their slaves to France without having to set them free. And so there were legal things. For example, if a slave owner wanted to bring their slaves to France, they needed to first get permission from the French person in charge in the colony, whoever the governor was of the colony needed to give permission. Then once they arrived in France, they needed to submit evidence to the courts that they have brought their slave and basically register the slave with the French courts. And they had to do it within a time frame. So if you went past the time frame, you were basically giving your slaves freedom. Now, this legal situation makes it so that a lot of French people think today and used to think back then that there were no slaves in France. That wasn't true because some slave owners followed the rules and were able to legally keep their slaves. Now, you can give me a guess. How many people do you think earned their freedom by suing their owners in a French court? A lot or not a lot?
Not a lot.
Yeah, many else in the chat, few, very few. One, you needed to know that this was the law. And if you are an enslaved person, if you are a slave, one, you're not allowed to read and write. Right? Whatever language you learned is not the language being used either in the colony or in France. So most enslaved people didn't even know how to read and write, much less have knowledge about this law that they could use to gain their freedom. On top of it, you needed to know how to sue your owner in a court. The number of people that knew how to do that was extremely minimal. So it tended to be highly educated enslaved people in France that end up finding out about this law and then have the resources to sue their owners in a French court. So it's very few people were able to do this. And yet there were some of them that did that. And like I said, every single person that did it gained their freedom. One of the noteworthy cases, because I want to give you a specific case, was the case of Jean Bocot. I will type his name in the chat. Jean Bocot. So Jean Bocot was an enslaved man. His owner was Bernard. I'm trying to type it in here. Verdelin. Bernard Verdelin. And Bernard Verdelin had a plantation in Haiti. Right. So in 1728 or 1729, we don't have the exact year. So it's either 1728 or 1729. Verdelin brings his slave to France, brings Bocot to France. Apparently, Bocot really liked, Verdelin really liked Bocot, especially his cooking. He got used to his cooking, and so he wanted to bring him to France and goes ahead and brings them. Now, it was supposed to be for a period of 9 years that Verdelin was going to stay in France, and then he was going to go back to Haiti. Well, during that time period, Bocot, who was the slave, falls in love with a French woman. And he marries this French woman without his owner's consent. Because he gets married, the owner freaks out. Because another loophole to the slavery laws was if a slave person married a legal French person, a free person, they were technically free. That's another reason why they didn't let Black people marry white women, because it could be a path towards freedom. So Bocot has done that. He has married a white French woman who is free. So Verdelin, the owner, freaks out and he ends up taking his slave to court. So actually the whole court case is initiated by the slave owner. The slave owner wants to annul marriage so that it legally doesn't exist and so that he can keep his slave. It turns out Bocot was probably planning on running away with his new wife. But because of this court, what Bocot argues is due to the edict of 1716, the freedom principle, that his owner actually has no legal right to him. On top of it, Verdenlat had failed to register his slave Bocaux within the 8 days in which he had to once arriving in France. So the court here was giving Verdenlat 8 days to register his slave in order to keep him enslaved. Verdenlat did not do that. So, and then he had married a white French woman, was supposed to already be free. Based on the marriage and based on the freedom principle, Bocaux was able to gain his freedom. So at least one happy story in history here. We don't get a ton of them most of the time when we teach this history, but I love that story because it's somebody who's able to do it. But one, it's somebody who had some level of education, who's able to read and write, who has access to the French courts, who married a French white woman, and who actually ends up in the court system, not because he chose to, but because of his owner, because of what his owner did, right? Trying to keep him as a slave. That story, you're not going to find in the databases for your paper, right? That story is not there, but it does exist in the legal documents, right? In the court cases, we've been able to find the cases in which people did this, right? Another thing you're not going to find in the databases that I've asked you to look at for your paper is the horrors of slavery. Well, you might be able to see them here and there. Actually, some of you, I already know, have been able to see the horrors of slavery. Some of you noted it as you were reading the Two Princes of Calabar, just in the numbers. When you start adding up the numbers from the database, add up how many people are being carried on each ship. Total up how many ships there are and how many people are being carried on each of these ships. The end result is huge. There are a large number of people being enslaved, right? In Haiti alone, right? When Haiti starts as a colony of France, there were really only between 1,000 and 2,000 slaves in Haiti initially. By the time you get to the 1780s, right before the French Revolution, there were every year somewhere around 37,000 slaves arriving to Haiti every single year. Can you imagine that? 37,000 slaves arriving every single year. What does that tell you? What does those numbers tell you? Why do those numbers matter? This is the question I asked in the prompt for the slavery paper, right? This is a little bit tricky, but can anybody give me just your first reaction? So this is not, I'm not asking for the most well thought out answer, just why would that number matter? Why does it matter that there are 37,000 people, slaves, arriving in Haiti every year?
The population of Africa might go down.
Oh, yes, that automatically tells you. Yes, and we know actually one of the effects of the slave trade is the effects on population, just simple population numbers in Africa, yeah, in West Africa in particular. Connor in the chat says there's a high turnover rate of slaves. They probably are dying too fast. Connor, that is an excellent analysis. That is an educated analysis of what is happening here, right? You don't even need to go dig into it, but actually we know that there was high turnover while the slave trade was legal. What is happening, in fact, it tells us that the value of slaves' lives, of the lives of people, was almost non-existent. You think that because these people are providing a lot of labor, that they would be taken care of. Well, no. People that couldn't afford to buy slaves did not value them because they have enough money. If one dies, they'll just buy another. So yeah, Connor, that could be your thesis for the slavery paper. Connor, you found a thesis. Many you have found another thesis for the slave paper, the extent of slavery. Here you want to add a little bit more to it. What can we tell here about the extent of slavery? Is it a small impact slavery has, or is it a big impact? It's a huge impact. We're talking about thousands and thousands of people, right, on every ship every year who are losing their freedom and who are experiencing extreme hardship, extreme hardship, right? That's what's hinted in the numbers. The numbers hint at that. We know more specifically about some of these horrors, right? One, the journey from the west coast of Africa to the Americas was extremely harsh. They were packing, because they are making so much money off of it, they're packing thousands and thousands of people on one ship. Ships that are not meant to carry that many people. What does that tell us about what life on a slave ship was like for enslaved people? Do you think everybody has a lot of room and it's a nice journey across the Atlantic? Are they on a cruise ship? No. In fact, we know based on the numbers of how many people go on a ship in the west coast of Africa, and then how many people arrive, you notice that there is a drop in numbers. The number of people that arrived in the Americas enslaved is actually smaller than the number of people they put on these ships. They expect that a significant number of people are going to die on the journey. And that is part of why they pack the ships. They don't care that people have enough room on the ships. Again, the value of life to these enslavers, life was cheap. Life was cheap. They're not feeding people enough. They're not sanitizing the ships. When you hear the stories that even the people working the slave ship, so not slaves, but the white workers on the ship, tell the descriptions they give of the slave ships is of extreme horror. People were packed and chained to one another so that you couldn't move. If the person you're chained right next to dies, you're stuck to them. You're stuck to them until their body gets thrown overboard. If you need to go to the bathroom, you go to the bathroom exactly where you're at. And the journey from the west coast of Africa to the Americas could take months. So you have of accumulated human feces, of sleeping next to dead bodies, possibly family members. That's horrific. That is horrific. Then once you arrive, it gets worse. Right? It got worse once you arrived in the Americas. One, the kind of labor expected on plantations is extremely harsh, right? We're talking about people being used in sugarcane plantations and tobacco plantations and cotton plantations that all require hard labor. The worst was sugarcane plantations. Cutting and taking care of sugarcane is notoriously difficult. And because nobody cared about the life of these people, it was just, they were being worked to death. On a plantation, the slave owner was responsible for feeding slaves, for clothing them, for housing them, but they were getting minimal food, only like what was needed in order to get up the next day and continue working. So the basic bare minimum. Clothes, they would get the cheapest cloth they could, often not even enough and not the right size to clothe people. Houses were kind of like log cabins is very generous. They were huts that were actually usually not very sturdy and where people had to live packed all into one. If your slave owner was particularly generous, you might have a hut for a family or two at a time, but that was extremely rare. people sometimes, even within this harsh slave system, found love. They fell in love and they got married, not legally married because slaves were not legally allowed to marry, but they had traditions that allowed people within slave communities to basically declare their love and their commitment to one another. Oh, Lou, I missed your hand.
Oh no, it just
Oh, okay,
I just
left over.
I just wanted to add, isn't it because like it was a way of them to keep their identity in some way?
Yes. It was a form of resisting the slave system, right? In the slave system, individuals don't matter. You're a number. People were a number. And one of the ways in which people fought back was to try to form relationships, to make connections to one another, and try to remind themselves that they were individuals. Yeah. It's a way of maintaining that. Yeah, Yeri, broomstick weddings were kind of common. So they had rituals like that have remained to today within like African American communities, for example, and within other like Black communities all over the Americas of like, okay, you jump over a broomstick and that was the official declaration that these two people are married. Yeah. So things like that. Sometimes the couple would just together with sometimes without even witnesses, they would head off somewhere private. They would declare their commitment to one another, maybe do a ritual. If any of them remembered rituals from communities back in Africa, or kind of from voodoo religion, for example, where it was very common in Haiti, they would perform a ritual and they were married. Yeah, it's a way of resisting it. People had kids also as a way of resisting the slave system, right? Sometimes you have people writing about this, how this was the only thing they had. It was their way of having something to themselves, to have a child. It was them, not something, even though the child legally belongs to the slave owners, a pregnant person felt that this was their child, something they were carrying that was for them and for their family. Now, you know the answer to this, so I'm going to ask it. Were families allowed to remain together in a slave system?
No.
Nope. Because these people are property. Slave owners encouraged their slaves to get married because they wanted couples to have kids. Anytime an enslaved person had a child, it was adding to the profits of the slave owner. Right. So that meant that you could have an enslaved person could have a child, and because they're property, the slave owner could at any point decide to sell your child, sell your husband, sell your wife. And it happened a lot. We see it because at the end of slavery, when slavery is abolished all over the Americas, people went to significant efforts to try to find family members. Most of them never do, by the way. Once families were separated in the slave system, they usually never get reunited again. As a result, the way some enslaved people resisted slavery was not to have children, it was actually to perform abortions. The sources we have on this are limited, but we do know that for some enslaved people, abortions were a form of resistance because they didn't want to give birth to a child that would only become property to their owner, that they would end up losing touch with. And so there was usually on most plantations, there was somebody on the plantation, or on large plantations, there was usually somebody who would have some medical knowledge about herbs. And so they would combine herbs sometimes into like liquid concoctions, or sometimes ingesting the herb themselves, making it into tea, things like that, that were known to be effective in inducing an abortion. So we know that abortions happened probably quite frequently on plantations. We don't have exact numbers because it's impossible to count. People were usually trying to hide abortions from slave owners. But based on the little bits of sources we have, they give us a hint that this was actually happening more widespread than slave owners thought. because you want especially after the end of the slave trade, right? The slave trade is officially ended by the British and the French. So at some point, it's illegal for slave ships to begin arriving in the Americas with more slaves. Now, they're still doing it illegally, but the numbers do significantly reduce. That is when slave owners panic about how they're going to gain more slaves. If the ships aren't arriving, how are you going to gain more slaves? Well, one of the solutions was make people have kids. Make people have kids. So something that was actually very common was to rape enslaved women, to rape people. Sometimes the slave owner did it himself, but sometimes they didn't want kids that would be lighter in skin. So sometimes what they would do, they would designate a male slave as the person in charge of basically inseminating enslaved women. And they would take this man from one plantation to the next, forcing him to rape the women at each plantation. Quite common that was. More common than we think. And so those dynamics are complex. Like what is happening there is rape, but it was all being initiated by the slave owners. Oftentimes, the man they were using didn't want to do it, but he had no option. He had no choice, right? He is property, and to say no or to try to run away would equal death. I'm trying to end on a positive note. How many of you have seen Django Unchained? Wait, no one? Some of you, none of you are Quentin Tarantino fans? Oh, man. Okay. Well, if you're into really violent movies, you might want to check out Django Unchained. But, okay, Aliyah says yes. It's the story of Django Unchained is basically this enslaved person who is, or this Black man who gains his freedom, but his wife is a slave. Leonardo DiCaprio plays like the evil enslaver who's taken this woman with him, and Django is on a quest to find her and free her, and he's violently killing everybody inside. The reason I bring up the movie is because it was sold at the time it came out as a kind of revenge fantasy, based on this idea that some people have that people who were enslaved did not fight back. The idea is enslaved people didn't fight back. So Quentin Tarantino in this movie was like, but what if they had? Let's give a Black man just the power to fight back and kill. Well, the reality is people did fight back. So really, Django Unchained is historically accurate in that people did. Armed resistance, revolts were actually very common. That's why in the US, they were so afraid of these revolts. They were very common in the Caribbean. They were very common throughout Latin America, right? People, because in a lot of places, like in Haiti, for example, enslaved people outnumbered the free French people by a lot. So if you organized, you could form an effective resistance. In fact, we're going to see that's exactly what happens in Haiti. The Haitian Revolution begins, one aspect of it begins as an organized slave rebellion that is ultimately successful, right? It's why in most places, slaves are not allowed to even touch a gun, much less own a gun. Why? Because if an enslaved person is allowed to possess a gun, it could help them organize a rebellion. And slave owners were deathly afraid of these rebellions. But we do have some, right? And even in the US, Nat Turner's rebellion was significant. But you had significant rebellions in places like Haiti and Martinique and Brazil, all over the place. There were slave rebellions. There was even a series of revolts in the 18th century in Manhattan, in New York. Place you don't think New York was a slave colony, but initially New York had a significant population of slaves. Most of the time in these rebellions, the ones we have documented, most of them were led by men, but we do have some evidence of female-led rebellions. Very little evidence, but we have some evidence. It's actually been really hard for historians to uncover some of that, some of those sources, but we do have that, and we know that women participated in these rebellions, are in arming themselves, but also in support of the men, feeding them, hiding them, caring for the wounds. But there are also smaller ways in which people rebelled slavery, right? Especially like in places like the American South, when in the American South, they would hear about rebellions happening in the Caribbean, for example. In the Caribbean, there were some very successful rebellions. Well, one of the things that slavers in the US did was try to prevent any information about these successful rebellions in making their way to their slaves. They would flat out just prevent the information from spreading. Other things they did was things like passing laws, not allowing slaves to read and write, not allowing them to possess guns. But that didn't mean that people didn't resist their status as slaves. One, people were always trying to run away. That's why laws had to be passed, forcing people to return slaves to their masters, to the slave owner, because people were constantly running away. But other things people would do is they would break tools. Oh, you want me to cut or to do this task? I can't do it. The tool has broken. In fact, slave owners often in their journals and in the magazines they wrote for one another, they often write complaining about how dumb their slaves are. They were often breaking tools. They're complaining about how lazy slaves are, that they had to be forced in order to do certain tasks. Well, do we believe the slave owners? Do you think their slaves were actually dumb when they were breaking tools and they were pretending not to understand directions? Usually you don't want to trust it. It's not anything a slave owner says, so you want to kind of read more into it. What historians now acknowledge is that actually that's all evidence of the way people resisted, right? If your life is in danger and you can't start rebellion, well, you're going to do smaller things like break tools, like pretend you're dumb, like pretend you don't understand the directions. Things like that were common in every plantation, and the evidence is right there in the complaints of the slave owners themselves, right? And that was widespread. That was often happening. All of those things were extremely common, those smaller forms of rebellion, right? So, okay, I will stop here. So basically the equivalent of one class period just talking about slavery. And I want to be fair, because without sharing my screen, one, you're not seeing the slides necessarily, and it's the way we process information is probably less. So I am thinking that the most fair way of handling this is to, one, do the videos on the citation and send them to you. And as a result, I'm ending class early, right? Ending class early because I'm giving you work to do outside of class, like watch videos. But I'm thinking it's unfair to ask you to write a discussion board post this week. What do you think? Should I cancel the discussion board post? Or do you want me to make it extra credit?
Make it extra credit, maybe? Because the slides are there. It's just, we just have to interpret it like our own way. I mean, there's
It's harder on your own, but it's doable. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, because
Okay.
it's like, because I noticed that some of the slides are like vague, but they are like understandable.
Okay. I'm vague on purpose, by the way, because if somebody is just looking at the slides, I'm like, I want you to pay attention to me too. But okay, extra credit. All right, I'll make those, I'll make this week's discussion extra credit, and I'll send an email making sure that people that aren't here know. But let me double check right now while I have you here, just to make sure that those questions are going to be answerable based on the PowerPoint and based on what we were able to at least get off of the discussion without me. Oh, you know what? No, I'm going to mess up my internet. If I start clicking on things. Okay, I'll double check. But I'll make all the questions extra credit so that if you only want to answer one of the questions, that you will still get points for that. So you can get partial points of extra credit by answering only one, or if you want to answer two. There's only 3 questions, I believe, in today's discussion post. So if you feel you can answer all of them, go ahead. But if not, then you only answer the ones that you want to for the points, or you don't have to do it at all. If you're like, I think I'm good, I'm not going to need extra credit, then we'll do that. Okay, so any other questions before I end class? Or anything else you're like, I include this in the video because I'm going to try to make those videos on citation as complete as possible. But no, okay, so we're all good. Okay, so
Yes.
class today was shorter. Next week, don't expect that. Next week we'll take up the whole time with the 15-minute break in the middle. So have a good weekend. If anything comes up though, any questions come up, please feel free